replay it and listen at your convenience. And we all know what a train buff Tim Fisher is. And I'll tell you what, someone else who's pretty keen on railways and railway history is Ron Stewien, who used to work for the South Australian Railways as permanent way engineer. And he's just completed the first volume of a book called The Early Years on the history of South Australian railways. And it's likely, so rich is our history, that it's likely to run to something like 7 volumes to complete it. Ron Stewien, good morning.
Good morning, Ashley, and actually it's going to run to 10 volumes.
10 volumes,
yes.
Is it? That's a lot, isn't it?
It is, and I'm not too sure I'll still be alive by the time the 10th volume comes out.
Not sure you'll ever finish it?
Somebody else might have to finish it.
Well, obviously you got involved with the railways as a permanent way engineer, so where did the fascination with the history come from?
Well, it all started in 1951 when I was working up in the drawing office of the South Australian Railways, and there was an old gentleman up there by the name of Lionel Kingsborough, and I had to work with him a bit, and he was the one who got me interested in railway history, and I've been interested in railway history ever since.
You've looked in this first volume of the history, just really at the early years. So what period do you take in this? And this is a big volume. It's not just a small volume, is it?
No. Well, it finishes just before 1860. And the first railway was opened in 1854. So as you can see, it doesn't cover a very long period, but a lot of things happened in that period. So the book's very comprehensive.
The early railways that we had in South Australia, and it wasn't that long ago that the Goulburn to Port Elliot line celebrated its 150th anniversary, I think.
That's right.
That would have been in 2004 because it started in 1854. But it wasn't a railway as we might know it today, was it? It was horse-drawn.
Well, no, it was much more primitive than what it is now, much lighter rails, and the timbers that they used for the sleepers were just the rough gum that was cut down in the hills, and there was no sawn timber like we use these days, and it was very rough indeed.
You mentioned the railway line, and the big thing that sticks in everyone's craw to some extent, I suppose, and is a big talking point in history, is the gauges. Now, how have we finished up with so many rail gauges in a country like Australia?
Well, you'll have to read my book to find out that. Well, the two main gauges are 4'8.5" and 5'3".
Just standard and broad gauges.
Yeah, I'm not terribly into metric, and that problem is discussed at some length in the book. The 3'6" gauge, which came in Queensland and Western Australia and Tasmania, that came later on, and that was a false economy in a way that people thought that would be cheaper than the other gauges. But as it turned out, they're not really that much cheaper anyway. 3'6" in Australia, 3'6" gauge has always been a slow gauge. Trains never went very fast, not like in South Africa where they can do 100 mile an hour on their 3'6" gauge.
What was the difference between Australia and South Africa? Why could they get such speeds there?
Well, 3'6" is the only gauge they've got in South Africa, so they've gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that track is very good and their rolling stock is very good as well, whereas in South Australia 3'6" was originally promoted as a cheaper railway.
Why was it thought to be cheaper? Because you didn't need the sleepers so wide, was it?
Well, the sleepers are shorter and you use less ballast, and that's the main difference. But in South Australia we also use lighter rails and smaller trucks, smaller engines, all the rest of it. And of course that eventually made them more expensive to run. The
original GAN line to Alice Springs up through the Pitchy Ritchie Pass, that was narrow gauge, wasn't it?
Yes, that was 3'6" gauge.
Because we ended up with all 3 gauges in South Australia.
Yeah, and at one stage we had more 3'6" gauge than we had 5'3", which were the first gauge in South Australia was 5'3", and then we foolishly started building railways in 3'6" later on. But some of those tracks now have been converted to 5'3", or even now to 4'8.5".
To the standard gauge.
Yes.
Because these days we've got, the suburban trains in Adelaide still run on the broad gauge, don't they?
Yes, they do.
But we've converted all the other lines, or a lot of the main line through to Melbourne is now standard gauge,
yes.
isn't it?
The main lines are all standard gauge, but we've still got some others, this broad gauge up beyond Gawler to Roseworthy and some of those areas.
The Steam Ranger runs on broad gauge, doesn't it?
Yes,
I think.
yes, and the Anguston line, which has a lot of stone traffic, that's still 5'3".
So how did the railways unfold in South Australia? The first line, well, we had the one down that we've talked a little bit about, Goolwa to Port Elliot, but then in Adelaide itself, the first line was from the city to the port, and that was what it was really all about, wasn't it? Even the Goolwa line was all about getting trains to the port, wasn't it?
Well, not Goolwa, Gawler.
Yeah, Goolwa.
Well, Gawler was a different proposition altogether. That was the governor at that time was dead keen to bring traffic down the River Murray from Victoria and so on. And the main problem was that you couldn't get shipping in over the entrance to the Murray. And he built a horse-drawn railway from Goolwa to Port Elliot to convey the goods coming down the river to a seaport. But that at the same time we were promoting the Adelaide-Port Adelaide railway at the same to connect Adelaide with its port, and also simultaneously Adelaide to Gawler. But Gawler was open a little bit later than Port Adelaide.
One of the things about, and you look at this in your book, looking at the early years of the history of South Australian Railways, your first volume of 10, and we're talking to Ron Stewien this morning, who is the author of that. He's a railway historian. You look and talk about the wonderful buildings along the line, and it was quite a feature of that first metropolitan line to Port Adelaide, and I think a lot of those buildings you can still see today are magnificent buildings, the railway stations, weren't they?
I wouldn't call them magnificent, but there are two stations at Bowden and Alberton, which are the original stations, which are still there. If you look at them now, there's a lot of graffiti on them and so on, and they don't look anywhere near as magnificent as probably what they would have looked when they were first built. The platforms were paved with blue and red paving stones, and that would have been a bit of a luxury by today's standards. But
the station itself at Port Adelaide, in the pictures I've seen in the book, looked quite grand because it came complete with its own tower. And I believe on a clear day you could see quite a distance back towards the city and along the line.
Well, the idea was to be able to see back about halfway, and they would have had a tower on the Adelaide station as well, except that money was getting tight, and the government said you've got to cut it off at that, where they were, and so the tower got missed out on the Adelaide station, and they weren't really necessary anyway.
We've got a few people who have called in as we talk about the history of railways in South Australia with Ron Stewien. In fact, Jeff has called in about gypsum trains. Hello, Jeff.
Yes, good morning, Ashley and Ron. Yeah, I think the one in the Innes National Park, wasn't that one of our first trains for carrying the gypsum to the port and made out of ironbark rails?
You've got me there. It certainly wasn't a South Australian Railways line.
No, I don't think it was South Australian Railways, but there's a plaque down there saying it was one of our first railway lines. It was made of ironbark for the actual railway lines, and they carted the gypsum to get it to the port.
No, I'm afraid you've got me a bit there. I haven't. My expertise is mainly the South Australian Railways, but there are other people around who could probably answer your question.
Yes, yeah. I just thought you might have known about it.
And where's the plaque, Jeff, itself? Whereabouts is this?
It's down in the Innes National Park.
On the bottom of York Peninsula?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. All right.
It's quite interesting.
Right. It would have been a private line, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it would have been run by the company that was doing the shipping of the gypsum.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Jeff, thank you very much. So someone else has phoned in to ask about the station just outside Bordertown that's 3 stories and it's now sometimes used for country balls. Do you know anything about that station?
At Bordertown?
It says just outside Bordertown. Wouldn't be the one at Serviceton, would it?
Well, Serviceton's on the Victorian Railways now.
That's right.
When it was first built, it was on what was called the disputed territory, because the border between Victoria and South Australia was in dispute, and actually the border now is on the wrong alignment. But they had a court case about it, and Victoria won, like they often do. And the station, which was built on the disputed territory, is now in Victoria.
Well, it's funny because my father was a station master in Victoria, and I know at one stage he was seriously considering the opportunity to transfer to Serviceton to work there. because in those days it had a pretty important role on the board. I don't know whether it's got quite the same, and probably it's not even, like a lot of stations these days, not even staffed. And I guess that's one of the things that's really changed, hasn't it, so much in railways?
Yeah, Silverstone used to be the point where they used to change the locomotive on all trains, really. They'd take off the SAR logo and put on a Victorian logo, or vice versa. But nowadays, that's all gone. The same logos work all the way through. It saves money, and it's more convenient to do it that way.
It's interesting reading your book and looking back at some of the quaint terms that were used in the early days, and there was a term that comes up quite a bit referring to the board of undertakers. And I kept looking at it thinking, what on earth have undertakers got to do with railways? But because you think of them as more to do with the last journey you ever take. But
yes, well, the building of that railway line was called an undertaking, and of course they had undertakers to look after it. But it's the only time I've ever heard of undertakers running a railway. But back in the back of the book, there's a excerpt from the papers of the opening of the line, which covers quite a few pages. But in it, the governor of South Australia at that time, who opened the line, he said he was dismayed when he came down to the station to catch the train that he was approached by a couple of undertakers. That caused a bit of a laugh from the audience.
Thought it might have been the last journey he was ever going to take, did he? But it was quite remarkable to look at the progress that was made, because we've talked a bit about it. The Gawler line was the next one. And in those days, I think they were doing trips to Gawler, and pretty much, in fact, you've got some timetables in there, pretty much as quickly as they do them today.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, it wouldn't have been quite as quick as today.
It's not only a few minutes in it.
Yeah.
I think of an hour and 10 was on the timetable, and I'm doing about an hour today.
That's right, yes. Well, I mean, you can't go much faster if you're stopping to pick up people at all the stations. And, of course, in those days, they wouldn't have had so many stations to stop and pick up people anyway.
Ron, the engines are very interesting, and you've dedicated quite a chapter or two in the book to the locomotives. Where did we get our engines from?
Well, in those days, they all came from England. It was a long time before we got them from anywhere else. We did get some from America in the 1880s, but they were built by Baldwins, and the American locomotives were built for a 10-year life. And we found that when we got them, that they were made cheap, but they were also didn't last as well as the English-made engines. And we didn't start building our own engines till in the 1890s, when they built a few at Islington, and James Martin at Gawler built engines for the South Australian Railways.
In fact, you can see still reminders of that if you go to the Gawler Museum and have a look there.
Yes,
it's a very important
right.
part of the history of Gawler. So what's the next volume?
Well, it should be volume 2, but it's not going to be volume 2. The Victorian division of ARHS has published this book for me, and they look like doing the next one as well. And they've said, well, could I do the one on the big engines that Bill Webb brought here in the 1920s? Because they think that'll be a good seller, and it'll perhaps then get people to buy the first volume again to keep their set. And so volume 6 will be the next one. And
so you'll jump from volume 1 to volume 6?
Well, I'm going to do 2, 3 and 4 later, but I'm going to do 5 and 6 next.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it'll be big engines and then...
Well, we go back to volume 2 then.
Volume 2.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, look, good luck with it.
Yes, I hope it will sell well.
I'm sure you do. Nice to talk to you this morning. That's Ron Stewien, who's the author of this new book, looks at the history of South Australian Railways, Volume 1, potentially of 10, and this looks at the early years.